Okay, so let's move on. Now, he was kind of the first to kind of bring this concept to light, but the person who really shut down logical positivism single-handedly was my favorite philosopher by the name of Thomas Kuhn. You saw his quote in the beginning. And he is perhaps one of the most influential people in the world today. He died, of course, in very recently. But he's not spoken about very much. But he is very influential in all fields of knowledge. And he has done a lot for the world in terms of understanding of science and our understanding of just reality. And he was a historian, but he came up with the scientific theory. And I'm just going to read his profile here. Thomas Kuhn, another American pragmatist who attended the same university as Quine and would subsequently be influenced by the latter, typo, advanced the idea of the holistic understanding of knowledge in his famous work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I believe in the introduction to this course, or this module, I gave this book as pre-reading material. Kuhn made three major points in his analysis of scientific history. The first is that science operates based on paradigms. Everyone in this room, I think, knows the word paradigm. Guess what? This guy, Thomas Kuhn, is the one who coined the term. He's the one who came up with the word. So you guys saying, oh, this is the paradigm, this paradigm. You see people in the media talking about paradigms. Him. He's the reason. Okay? The first is that science operates based on paradigms or holistic, culturally inherited theories that help us to make sense of experiences. So a paradigm is basically a worldview. Like the Islamic worldview is a paradigm. Okay? The second is that most applied science that makes anything close to progress, what he calls normal science, is mainly about solving puzzles within a given paradigm. So what he says is that all the science we do today, like you see people doing experiments, they're operating by a certain paradigm. Okay, a certain paradigm about reality. A certain paradigm, even like sub-paradigms, like a certain understanding of how physics works, right? Like today we have something called quantum physics. Scientists work within that paradigm of physics, okay? And he would say that these people are doing normal science. So they're working within this little paradigm. They're not challenging the paradigm, they're working within it. So all the experimentation, all the academic articles, all the research is done within a specific paradigm. Even in biology, evolution is what? It's not just a theory, it's also a paradigm. Okay? And third, there are paradigm shifts or revolutions which result from normal science's inability to solve the anomalies faced by an established paradigm. What does this mean? Okay, basically he found out that once a paradigm becomes very successful, say evolution or something else, gravity, things like this, what happens eventually is that there are some problems. Scientists begin to observe things that are not normal, meaning that they're not in accordance with the paradigm, meaning that they don't work as they should. Like if a paradigm says it should be like this, for some reason, something they've observed does something completely different. And they're like, okay, why does this happen? And they start to encounter more and more of these issues. Like the more data they collect, the more the anomalies or the changes, the differences become more and more like strenuous to the theory. So the theory becomes heavier and heavier, it becomes more convoluted, more complex. And the scientists keep tweaking the theory, like they keep changing little parts of it, saying, okay, well, a good example is evolution. So for example, you know, it was kind of simple in the beginning and now they're kind of giving more explanations to it to try to explain some things they keep finding that aren't going to plan, you know what I'm saying? So they keep tweaking things. And they keep saying, well, you know, there's an issue here. So we got to change this. Let's move this around. Maybe it's not like this. So let's change the theory a little bit like this. And this keeps going and going until finally somebody sits down and goes, hey guys, this is way too complex now. And I think it can be more simple than this. And they go, okay, here's a new paradigm. Boom. This is more simple. This solves all the problems. Let's switch to this. And there's historical examples of this happening. This is the reason he came up with this is because his primary example was, let's see, new question. Okay, Ahmed Faraz, salam alaikum. Like, for example, the tree of life becoming the web of life, is that a tweak in the theory? Yes, it is. common ancestry theories have been changing dramatically because they keep finding things that don't go to plan. See what I'm saying? Now, this happens within every major theory, to be honest. It doesn't mean, we're going to talk about what a theory is in a moment. It doesn't mean that the theory is wrong, okay? It just means that the theory is not entirely able to explain the data. Okay, so let's keep going though. So, for example, his example was he looked at the Ptolemaic system and the Copernican system. So heliocentric versus geocentric. Okay, geocentric system was basically what? The Earth was the center of the galaxy, the universe, right? Heliocentric, the sun is the center, right? Okay. So what happened? This was a paradigm shift, and what happened was that Ptolemy, he explained the universe in this way. It was basically like the planets and everything and the sun were rotating around the Earth, and sometimes the motions of the Earth of the planets would be kind of erratic. It'd be kind of weird. So he explained it like, okay, it must be that way because not only are the planets and the sun going like this, but they're also kind of going like this, right? Like little circles. Okay, epicycles. I think I have a diagram. Let me show you. Boom, there it is. It's horribly, horribly blurry. Okay, so the geocentric system is here. And if you can see on the left side, so basically all these planets and the sun would rotate around the Earth, not just in one circular fashion, but they would do epicycles. So squigglies. And one day, a lot of scientists came along and said, even from the Islamic tradition, by the way, mainly the first people to question the Ptolemaic system were scientists from the Islamic tradition, like Al-Kushti, who was the first one to advance the idea that the Earth was not stationary. In actuality, it rotated. So Copernicus got a lot of his ideas from Muslim philosophers and Muslim scientists. And eventually what happened was that all of these problems kept adding up. Like there was just too much stuff. Like, why is it this complicated? And we still can't understand why the planets are moving in certain ways. Like there was like Venus and Mercury were still kind of acting weird, you know? So why this epicycles, there's got to be another problem. So they kept trying to add more things and it just got more and more confusing. And then eventually somebody said, you know, I have an idea. Maybe instead of putting the Earth in the center, let's put the sun in the center and see how it works. And guess what? All of those little squiggly lines went away. And then scientists were like, this makes more sense. And they adopted the heliocentric system. Now, according to many atheists today, the only way to understand or to justify a theory or to justify the way something works is if it's directly observable, or you know, if you can actually see what's going on. Like basically, Copernicus would have to go up into space and like observe directly this phenomenon, but he didn't. He only proposed this theory because why? Because it was to solve. Let's go back to solve the issues with the Ptolemaic system, this geocentric system. So Thomas Kuhn was, when he published this work, he was very famous for it, and he changed the way in which we understood science as not being this gradual process of events, of data collection and theories building upon each other. He also revealed that knowledge was holistic. It wasn't reducible to like logical axioms, like just observable phenomenon. And that in fact, theories were not direct representations of the world that we know it. Theories, in a way, were more or less like commentaries or explanations about how the data should look. So say you have all this data, all this observational data that you have. And what he said was basically a theory is just taking all that data together and trying to make it fit like a puzzle in the right places. That's it. And the way I like to define a theory is as a tafsir. Okay, a scientific theory essentially to the scientific community is what we consider to be a tafsir. Okay, like the tafsir to the Quran, to the scientific community, a theory is a tafsir to the world. Okay? Now, essentially then, science is not, does it accurately depict all of reality? No, because every theory has its own share of problems, which we eventually have to correct. right? And every theory has a new model for things. So how can it be progressing if every new theory is different from the last one, right? It doesn't take from it. It literally is a different thing. Like the geocentric system was the Earth was the center, right? And then this heliocentric was the sun was the center. That's a completely different paradigm, correct? So it's not progressive. It's not even realism. It's not even tied to reality because the theory itself is only constructed to make sense of what we see. It doesn't actually explain the exact representation of reality itself. If that were the case, then Copernicus would have never come up with this theory, right? He literally was sitting at a desk when he came up with this theory. How did he do it? If he had to directly observe what was in front of him, if it was reality itself, that he was observing, he didn't. He came up with it in his mind to solve these dilemmas. So this was essentially the end of positivism at that point. Unfortunately, it was only the end of positivism and scientism in the academic sense. Okay, so anonymous attendee, assalamu alaikum. Can we say that naturalism is a paradigm and Darwinian evolution is a physical explanation of the reality? The paradigm is to explain everything without invoking the divine. Yes, we can. Naturalism is a sort of a meta paradigm. Naturalism is a paradigm, and we could say that Darwinian evolution, I just prefer to say evolution because we've moved quite a long ways since Darwin. The evolutionary theory now is not very similar to Darwin's. And it's similar in some respects, but they've changed a lot. So evolution would be a theory, a physical explanation of the reality that we see, but it's not the reality. So it's not a realistic. Now, people who follow scientism will say it is, and we're about to debate that in a moment. Because if you've been following this history, you'll see that Kuhn et al. Basically destroyed this understanding of science already. So why is it still here? Okay, well, we're going to explain that. Especially, why is it among atheists? Well, you see, when something is destroyed in the academic arena, when something is debated in the academic arena, it doesn't always transfer to the society, especially today. Not only that, but atheists were the first ones to sort of come back and revive scientism. And we're about to find out who did, who was the first one to do it. Okay, so let's see who's next. Antony Flew. Who knows Antony Flew? I'm sure a lot of you do. You might have read his books. He is a famous philosopher in the 1970s, atheist who became a deist because he believed in these so-called scientific miracles of existence that led him to believe in God. And he eventually wrote a book about it, and then he passed away in 2010. He was also a very charming individual, a very good person, a very good philosopher. But he came up with something very interesting. I don't know if you've heard all this, but you're about to find out. Oh, also, George Smith came after him. And then you have Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Victor Stenger. So this is the Isnad. Okay? We're about to complete our Isnad, right? Antony Flew, possibly the most famous atheist of the 20th century, who would later eventually become a deist, was the first to construct the idea, yes, there is a God. There is a God was the name of Antony Flew's book. See, you guys know. You just never knew the history, huh? I'm connecting all the dots for you now. Before we go on, another comment, anonymous attendee. Can we still benefit from theories if they are not so definitive? Yes, of course. We can. Because the data itself is still true. What we observe is still a thing. How we interpret it is the issue. Okay. So a commentary can assist you in reading the Quran, for instance, right? But there are still differences of opinions within those commentaries. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So here we go. Let me continue reading with Antony Flew. Possibly the most famous atheist of the 20th century, would later eventually become a deist, was the first to construct the idea of weak, negative, and strong positive atheism. the former of which he promoted as the presumption of atheism. And his reason for the construction of these labels are as followed. What the protagonist of the presumption of atheism, in my sense, wants to show is that the debate about the existence of God ought to be conducted in a particular way, and that the issue should be seen in a certain perspective. His thesis about the onus of proof it is up to the theist first to introduce and to defend his proposed concept of God, and second, to provide sufficient reason for believing that his concept of his does in fact have an application. Okay, translation. You know how atheists tell you today that they lack a belief in God? He's the one. He's the reason. He's the reason. He did not change. Another question. Did Flew change his mind on the presumption of atheism once he became a deist? No, he did not. In fact, he followed this presumption, and that's why he became a deist. I don't actually agree with the reason he became a deist, by the way. Just throwing it out there. But he was very consistent with his principles. As somebody who has studied the philosophy of science, we can discuss this at a later point. I am not a fan of believing in God on the basis of so-called scientific miracles. I think that is a false understanding of how to come to God's existence. That's all I'll say. We can discuss that at a later point, but I'm just giving you a clue as to right now, because if you understand what science is, you will not come to that conclusion. Right? Okay. We'll discuss that later. So anyways, he said that basically he came up with the idea of lacking belief in God. He said atheists don't, there are strong atheists, positive atheists who believe that God doesn't exist, but there are also weak or negative atheists like myself and other people, that's what he said, or most atheists, who just lack a belief. Therefore, the default position is atheism, and you have to prove to us that God exists. That's what Anthony Flew came up with. Okay, and he calls it the presumption of atheism. Now, another philosopher came along. Now, Anthony Flew, by the way, did not assume that the presumption could be met through science alone. He believed that philosophical inquiry or philosophical argument could also be used to prove God's existence. But somebody else came along, another philosopher who followed his lectures, and decided to revive scientism as a result of this. His name was George Smith. He's not very well known, but he's the reason for everyone else below him. Okay? George Smith, another atheist philosopher who was influenced by Anthony Flew's new understanding of atheism, would advance the latter's ideas in such a way that he would provide the foundation for contemporary atheist thought. If you want to know why contemporary atheists believe what they believe today, he's your man. He's not, like I said, he's not well known, but I have searched far and wide for the persons who gave, for the people who gave the ideas to Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, etc., and this is him. Okay. Like I said, this is why you should study history and the philosophy of idea and philosophy of history and things like this, because then you can figure out where these ideas are coming from. Where Flew might accept philosophical argument to oppose his presumption of atheism, Smith believed that it was impossible to do so, and I quote from his book, Atheism, The Case Against God, probably his only published work. Naturalism has the priority over supernaturalism, not because it is the more economical of two explanations, but because it is the only framework in which explanation is possible. The contest between naturalism and supernaturalism is not a battle between two rival modes of explanation. Naturalism is the only context in which the concept of explanation has meaning. What does that sound like? Logical positivism. But instead of saying that the statement has no meaning until it's empirically verified, what he's saying is what? An explanation has no meaning unless it's empirically verified. Abdullah Rahman, salam alaikum. What does lacking a belief even mean? That's a good question. What does lacking a belief mean? To give you a brief, lacking belief can be meant in two ways. A lack of belief can be meant as having no awareness of the belief whatsoever, like being a rock or a tree, or being a baby even. I mean, even the babies have fitra, but they don't really comprehend God. You know, they don't understand what that means. They have an inclination towards it, but they don't, you know, a baby's born, they don't understand God like we do. Or a lack of belief can mean that I just don't believe it because I don't have a reason to. A suspension of judgment is usually how atheists refer to as is. A lack of belief is a suspension of judgment, like I just don't know. So, you know, like if I say I don't know, basically it's their way of saying I don't know, is I lack a belief. It can be used as a defense mechanism. Now, if you want to get really deep into it, so Abu Faris, salam alaikum, what are your views on negative atheism as an intellectual position? Does it have intellectual cogency or is it simply an obfuscation? It is a position in the sense of being a state of being, but not as in like a proposition itself. And I was about to explain what I mean by that in a moment. So, for example, if I lack a belief in God, there has to be a reason for that, right? Not just because I'm unaware, because I'm obviously aware of God or the concept of God if I say I lack a belief in God, right? So what does it mean to lack a belief in that sense? It means that, well, I don't have evidence or I don't have a reason, right? So there, now you're seeing positive beliefs. It's no longer a negative belief. Now it's a positive. So the lacking itself might be negative, but the positive aspects, there are positive aspects behind it. You can't lack something without having a reason for it, right? Like if I say I lack a belief in Bigfoot, and somebody says why, I'm going to tell you, well, I don't have evidence. There's no reason for me to, right? But then you can ask other questions. Well, what do you mean by evidence? What do you mean by reason, right? Lacking a belief doesn't make you rational by default. And I wish, actually, I had a video I was going to show you, but I thought it would take too long. And I've been talking so much, taking up so much time, so we're not going to see it anyway. But let me give you an example. Flat earthers, people who believe in a flat earth, they lack belief in that the earth is round. There you go. But nobody calls them rational. I wonder why. So, but there are reasons why they lack a belief, right? Because they don't understand science, maybe. They don't understand what they're asking for in terms of evidence. In the same way, I treat atheists like this. I treat atheists like they're flat earthers. I consider them the metaphysical flat earthers. Okay, like they always ask, well, there's no reason to believe in God. I don't try to provide reasons to them. Then I don't try to provide evidence, because you know what I first do? I question their reasons. I question why they lack belief. Most people don't do that these days. First thing they do is they go straight to the arguments, like Ustaz Hamza was telling you. You know, they go on the defensive, right? No. If your skepticism is ridiculous, there's no reason for me to answer you. If you tell me, for instance, I lack belief that this is reality, what am I going to do? You know, you want me to answer that? That's ridiculous. That's nonsense. You know, there's a certain proposition, certain forms of skepticism that are just nonsensical. What would be the point of even going into it? In the same way I treat atheists. They hate it when I do that because they feel like they're so superior intellectually. But with their understanding of science, when they say, I want evidence for God's existence through scientific inquiry, and I say, do you understand science? Because you wouldn't be asking me that question if you did. Anonymous attendee, assalamu alaikum. What is the difference between positive and negative atheism? As I've already said, negative atheism is a lack of belief. It means that I don't have, I don't know if I believe or not. It's sort of like agnosticism, okay? And then, in fact, it is agnosticism, but this would replace it later. So Flew eventually would say agnosticism is nonsense. It's just a form of atheism. It's a negative atheism. And positive atheism or strong atheism is basically, I do not believe God exists, meaning that there's a firm belief that God does not exist. Okay? There is a difference between those two. There's a major difference. Another question, why, by anonymous attendee, assalamu alaikum, why is naturalism considered superior to supernaturalism? Because according to, I don't believe that, but according to Smith, it's because it's the only context in which we can understand anything. You look around the world, you don't see the supernatural, right? You don't see God, you don't see angels, you don't see jinn, you don't see anything. You only see what? Grass, trees, my house, a computer screen. That's all you see. So according to Smith, because that's your only point of reference, that makes it superior. According to Smith. Now, I actually have arguments against Smith's arguments, more detailed ones on my website, asadullahali.com. You can go on there and find my article. I probably link it later in the course module introduction. I didn't think we were going to get into the discussion, but where I basically show why his argument is false. I go into more detail and I prove that it's wrong. And I'll give you a concise format here. Basically, he says that because this is the only context in which we live, that we can't presume that there's a God, right? I actually accept his argument, and I say this. I say, okay, well, if that's true, if it's true that this is the only point of reference that we have, then in fact, you're wrong, because then we shouldn't even think about God. There should be no mention of God. The whole concept of God shouldn't even come into our minds if this is all we can perceive and understand. If this is the only context in which we can explain anything, then the concept of a transcendent being who is beyond the physical characteristics of the natural world shouldn't even pop into our minds. That's my explanation, or my argument. It's sort of like a reverse ontological argument. I think it's very good, but whatever. That's not the point of this lecture. You guys can judge it for yourself. Excuse me. So he revived this sort of scientific understanding and verificationism through the idea of explanation. Instead of statements requiring meaning in order to be, instead of statements requiring verification, physical phenomena in order to have meaning, he instead said explanation. So now it's no longer self-refuting. Okay. But there are some major problems with it. Anonymous attendees, do you believe atheists actually exist, or do you believe they don't exist in the true sense? I believe that everyone's upon the fitra. So I believe that atheists are going through cognitive dissonance. And in fact, this is a proven fact. If you look up any study on the nature of belief today, there are only two types of people who are atheist in the explicit sense. One, normally mentally healthy individuals who continuously reminded of the natural inclination to believe that there's purpose and design in the world. Okay, the atheists will complain themselves about this. Like, oh, they even talk like this. They feel like they always talk like there's purpose out there. They can't get rid of it. You'll see a lot of articles online in this respect as well. Atheists complaining about this natural inclination. But they'll just sort of write it off and say, well, it doesn't prove anything. That's just an evolutionary trait that I have because my ancestors, developed this thing because, to warn themselves of predators around them. So they saw intention and purpose everywhere, things like this. So that's what it is. That's the reason it came about. So they'll try to explain it through some sort of evolutionary byproduct. And then you have another group, which is basically people with autism. Asperger's is one of the two. I'm sorry, I'm not thinking very clearly right now. But people with mental deficiencies in certain regards people who have difficulty empathizing or sympathizing with others or understanding human emotion, they tend to be atheists very easily. People who are very technical. I think it's Asperger's, or is it autistic, whatever. They tend to be more inclined towards that. And you can actually see this on the online world as well. If you notice, I think it's Asperger's, yeah. Some people are pretty much borderline Asperger's because if you notice how people interpret scripture, they do it in such a way that it's almost like they can't understand metaphor. They can't understand context. They can't understand holistic understanding of the text. And they tend to be atheist. So when you wonder why atheists like to cherry pick passages from the Quran and present them in like this matter-of-fact way, it might have more to do with them having a certain condition. I'm not saying all of them, but there might be a sizable minority that are like that. And there are studies out there that show that people with Asperger's and even autism, I think, are more prone to be atheists. And these are some of the traits they have, is that they read everything very literalistically. So just something to remember, something to note. All right, so George Smith was the one to revive scientism among society, and especially the atheist community. We have about 25 minutes here. And I want to save some time for more question and answers, so we're going to get to the end and maybe even explain some Islamic history as well. I gave you guys an article in the introduction that you can read.